All right, folks, welcome back. Let's get into Thompson's argument. The question she's asking is killing worse than letting die? And it's fairly common to think that it is, right? That it's worse to take another's life than it is to allow someone to die, to pass away from natural causes. We might think, for example, that it's much worse to murder someone than it is to pull the plug on them and allow them to pass away because they lack life support. So killing, it seems, is worse than letting someone die, than merely letting someone die. But how should we understand what this claim means? Does it mean that for every pair of otherwise identical acts, actual or possible, imagined, one of which is a letting die and the other of which is a killing, that the killing is always worse? Well, Thompson's going to argue that it can't be that it's more complicated than that it's not just that if we have two identical acts, one which is a killing and one which is a letting die, the killing is always worse. There's just more to it. Why should we care about this? Well, when Thompson's writing this piece, this distinction between killing and letting die is really important to two arguments that are going on in the philosophical literature at that time, and two arguments that are still going on in our society today, arguments over abortion and euthanasia. In the abortion case, if killing is always worse than letting die, then killing a fetus, if we think it's a person, is worse than letting a mother die. Or killing is worse than allowing a fetus that could have been saved to die. So there's one place where this claim gets made. And in discussing euthanasia, or physician-assisted suicide, actively bringing about the death of a patient, whether through euthanasia or by prescribing drugs that the patient will use to kill themselves, it seems would be worse than removing life support and letting the patient die. And Thompson wants to argue that, well, it's not so easy to make those claims, right? We can't just mechanistically or mechanically rely on this distinction between killing and letting die to make these arguments. There's much more nuance going on here. And so the point of her article, really, is to bring out that nuance, to show that this distinction is more complicated than a simple mechanical distinction between killing and letting die, and then to point toward or gesture toward some of the underlying distinctions that we seem to be making when we make judgments about killing and letting die. So there's a lot going on here, and a lot of it goes by very quickly in the article that I had you read. So I'm going to take some time to try to unpack it. Let's get started with that unpacking. So the first thing Thompson does is to consider an objection to the common view. She objects and says killing and letting die are equally bad. Think about these two cases. Alfred hates his wife and wants her dead, so he puts cleaning fluid in her coffee and kills her. That's bad. And the other case, Bert hates his wife and wants her dead. She puts cleaning fluid in her own coffee. She's muddled, confused. She thinks it's cream. Bert happens to have the antidote to the cleaning fluid, but he does not give it to her. He lets her die. That seems equally awful, right? He wanted her dead. He intended for her to be dead in both cases. In one case, he killed her actively. In the other case, he just refrained from helping her and ensured her death. Both of those things seem really bad. So killing and letting die can't always be of different moral values or different moral worths. Right? Sometimes they're just both bad things to do. To reinforce her case that killing and letting die might sometimes be equally bad, she asks us to consider another example. She says, jumping to the conclusion that killing and letting die are of different moral worths is similar to jumping to the conclusion that beheading and punching in the nose are equally bad when we're presented with this sort of case. Elfrida knows that if she cuts off Alfred's head, he'll die, and wanting him to die, she cuts it off. Bertha knows that if she punches Bert in the nose, he'll die because he has some peculiar physical condition, and wanting him to die, she punches him in the nose. But what Bertha does is surely every bit as bad as what Elfrida does, so cutting off a man's head isn't worse than punching a man in the nose. Whoa, wait, that conclusion's way too fast. So cutting off a man's head isn't worse than punching a man in the nose. Well, and killing isn't worse than letting die. It's not easy to say exactly what's wrong in this argument, Thompson says, because it's not clear what we mean when we say such things as cutting off a man's head is worse than punching a man in the nose. And it's not clear what we mean when we say killing someone is worse than letting them die. But clearly there are a lot of cases where punching or cutting off a man's head is worse than punching them in the nose, even though there are some counterexamples. And clearly there are a lot of cases where killing someone is worse than letting die, even though there are some counterexamples. So just because we can come up with one counterexample doesn't mean that the rule doesn't hold or that it's not a good generalization. We might just need to refine it somewhat. So Thompson wants to engage in that sort of refinement, right? So let's consider another case, right? Maybe killing is worse than letting die. She considers Charles. He's a great transplant surgeon. One of his patients needs a new heart, but he's of a relatively rare blood type. By chance, Charles learns of a healthy specimen of that very blood type, so Charles can take the healthy specimen's heart, killing him, and install it in his patient, saving him. Or he can refrain from taking the healthy specimen's heart, letting his patient die. Clearly, Charles should let his patient die rather than killing someone else to save his patient. So maybe killing is worse than letting die. At least in that sort of case, the intuition seems to fit, or the generalization seems to fit, that killing is worse than letting die. So maybe it is. And if we up the ante a little bit, we seem to arrive at the same judgment. So consider David, who, like Charles, is a great transplant surgeon. 5 of his patients need new body parts. One needs a heart, the others need, respectively, a liver, a stomach, a spleen, and a spinal cord. But all of them are of the same relatively rare blood type. So by chance, David learns of a healthy specimen with that very blood type. He can take that healthy specimen, carve him up for his parts, and install them in his patients, saving them. Or he can refrain from taking the healthy specimen's parts and let his patients die. Now, we seem to think, most people seem to think, I think, that David should let his patients die. He can't kill a healthy person and carve them up for their parts just to save 5 other people. Now, if we're thinking purely in terms of utility or general welfare, that might seem like a reasonable thing to do because it's 5 people versus 1 person. But killing that 1 person is much worse than letting those 5 other people die. Or at least so it seems to us. Killing is worse than letting die in this sort of case. But we're not done, because now Thompson introduces what she calls a lovely, nasty difficulty. What a wonderful turn of phrase. A lovely, nasty difficulty from Philippa Foot. And here's where we get our first trolley problem. Edward is the driver of a trolley whose brakes have just failed. On the track ahead of him are 5 people. The banks are so steep that they'll not be able to get off the track in time. The track has a spur leading off to the right, and Edward can turn the trolley onto it. Unfortunately, there's 1 person on the right-hand track. Edward can turn the trolley, killing the 1, or he can refrain from turning the trolley, killing the 5. What should Edward do? Well, it seems like, as the driver of the trolley, Edward is responsible for doing as little damage as possible once the trolley's brakes have failed and it's running away. So it seems that Edward should switch it to the right-hand track and kill just one person in order to save 5 people. So killing 1 to save 5 is preferable to letting 5 die, which is what will happen if the trolley just continues traveling on down the track. Maybe it matters, though, that Edward's the driver, because he's responsible for the trolley and for making sure that it's in proper working condition. And so maybe we don't think that he's actually letting the 5 die, but he's choosing to kill the 5 rather than to kill the 1. And he should kill the 1 rather than kill the 5. So, we'll look at another example in a second to see if we can push that idea. But at this point, Thompson says, look, killing and letting die apart, in fact, it's a lovely, nasty difficulty. Why is it that Edward may turn the trolley to save his 5, but David may not cut up his healthy specimen to save his 5? Why is it that in this case we think it's acceptable to kill 1 to save 5, but in the surgeon case we don't think it's acceptable to kill 1 to save 5? There's got to be a reasoned difference here. There's got to be a way to make this distinction in a principled way. Otherwise, we might as well give up ethics, right? We're just making these decisions willy-nilly. We have no way of distinguishing between the cases. So we'd better be able to distinguish between these cases and say why it's okay, even preferable, for Edward to turn the trolley onto the 1 to save the 5, but not for David to kill the 1 to save his 5. It's a tricky thing to figure out, right? Let's look at the second trolley case, the first variation she gives us. Here, we're thinking, rather than about Edward, about Frank. Frank is a passenger on the trolley. The driver has just shouted that the trolley's brakes have failed, and then he died of shock. Poor Edward, the driver. On the track ahead of are 5 people. The banks are so steep that they can't escape. There's a spur leading off to the right again, and Frank can turn the trolley onto it. Unfortunately, there's a person on that right-hand side. Frank can turn the trolley, killing the 1, or he can refrain from turning the trolley and let the 5 die. Well, first, what's the difference between Frank and Edward? Well, Frank isn't the driver of the trolley. Frank has no responsibility for where the trolley's headed. He didn't put it on these tracks. It wasn't his responsibility to make sure that the brakes were working before they got on the trolley. He's just a passenger. Dude's just on his way to work. And all of a sudden, he's in this situation. Right? Now, if he doesn't do anything, he just stays in his seat and hangs out there and lets the trolley rumble on down the track and kill those 5 people, he's in no way responsible for their deaths. He didn't kill them. They died because the trolley was out of control. Frank didn't do anything, right? Frank was just a passenger. He's no more responsible for their deaths than any other passengers who were on there. And none of them are responsible for their death because none of them are responsible for making sure the trolley's in proper working condition. None of them put it on that track. Now, if Frank changes tracks and kills the 1 on the other track in order to save the 5 on the track in front of them, he is responsible for killing that 1 person. He redirected the trolley toward that 1 person. He killed that person in order to save 5. So this is, we think, a little bit more like the Charles and David cases, the surgeon cases. Right? Frank really does kill 1 to save 5 here. It's not a choice between killing 1 and killing 5 as it may be for Edward. Yet most of us, I bet, still think that Frank at least can turn the trolley to save 1 to kill 5, and probably that he should turn the trolley to kill 1 to save 5. We think that that's the right thing for Frank to do, is to save 5 lives, and it's unfortunate that 1 has to die in the process of saving 5, but we think that Frank ought to do it. So where are we? Well, we've got this tension now, right? There are some cases where killing one person to save 5 is clearly wrong, right? The surgeon case, killing one person to save 5 is clearly wrong, and we think that it's possibly because killing is worse than letting the 5 people die, or is a worse act than letting the 5 people die. But now we've got another case where killing someone, killing one person on the one side of the track, or on the spur of the track, is not only permissible, but maybe even what you're obligated to do in order to save 5. So killing is no longer worse than letting die in this case. Letting the 5 die, it seems, would be worse than killing the 1. How do we distinguish between these cases? What's the difference that matters here? That's what we're going to pick up on in the next lecture.